I'm Tim Tyler, and this is a video about species fusion, and in it I'll be discussing the expected effects of genetic engineering and intelligent design on the divisions between species in the future. I better start by saying what I mean by the term species. Species is a term with multiple definitions, and in some respects the definition depends on whether or not you're talking about a sexual species or an asexual species, but in sexual species there's a reasonable consensus that the concept of species refers to a collection of organisms that can interbreed with one another, or alternatively an evolving lineage that forms a single gene pool, and the definition is not exactly precise. Indeed, the whole concept of species as a category is not terribly precise, because, as we know from Darwin's evolutionary theory, species gradually change and form other species, and there's not necessarily a clear point where the division takes place. So the concept is a bit vague, but it's clear enough for most purposes. I'm going to illustrate what I expect to happen to the future of the species concept by using a phylogenetic tree. So here's a diagram representing that. You can see the root of the tree at the bottom, and then this is a successful lineage, so it's branching as time passes, and then I'm going to show you the passage of time. So more species, a few species die out, but still more species. And then around about here, genetic engineering is invented, and what you see is horizontal gene transfer between the branches of the tree. So no longer do you have a tree where the branches can't share information anymore. Instead, information gets transmitted horizontally between the various different branches, and as time passes you see something like this. So that's my diagram illustrating the effect of genetic engineering on the concept of species. Basically, the divisions between species kind of, well, not exactly break down completely, but species all become much more closely related to each other than they are down here. Here, if you look at where the last common ancestor is between two widely separated species, the common ancestor is often down near the root of the tree somewhere, whereas up here the last common ancestor is relatively recent. Species are more related to each other once genetic engineering has taken off. So that's my diagram. The whole idea of horizontal gene transfer isn't entirely new. It's not something that just arose on the scene with genetic engineering. If you look down near the root of the tree of life, then there's a whole bunch of bacteria, and they have horizontal gene transfer anyway. Their phylogenetic tree isn't a tree at all, it's a kind of a web of life rather than the tree of life. So the concept of horizontal gene transfer is not new, and to some extent it's been happening in the metazoans as well. If you look at the genes of metazoans, you'll occasionally see sections of the genome that have been pasted in by a virus, and sometimes viruses don't just infect one species, they either can infect multiple different species, or alternatively the life cycle of the pathogen can go through multiple species as part of its life cycle, and the virus can often drag parts of the host genome with it, so it'll take some junk DNA basically from the host and then move it across into another organism. So there's a case where horizontal gene transfer can take place even before we invented genetic engineering, but it seems as though, although it's a relatively common phenomena, it's not common enough to kind of break the barriers between species, and species remain relatively distinct, and they don't form closely related links with other organisms that are widely separated from them, basically. So although horizontal gene transfer existed before, it wasn't really a big phenomenon, whereas it looks as though in the future there'll be a lot more horizontal gene transfer taking place. The one question that arises when you look at a diagram like this is whether or not this is effectively everything turning into one big melting pot, and the whole divisions between species breaking down. And although relatedness between individuals looks as though it's going to increase, this isn't quite the same as all being one species. You'll still have kind of morphological divisions between species, so there'll still be beetles and elephants or other things that fit similar niches, basically. So although everything's closely related, there will still be divisions between species, it seems like. And the reason we can see that is because we've got other engineered ecosystems to look at. So we can look at, for example, public domain software, where there's although you've got a big melting pot and everybody can look at everybody else's source code and borrow freely from it, you don't have all the computer programs all merging into one big computer program necessarily. There are distinct computer programs still, with still kind of establishable hierarchical relationships between them. So there's something like a phylogenetic tree still, despite the fact that there can be free information transfer between the different lineages. So it's not going to completely destroy the whole concept of a tree, and there's still going to be kind of distinct species. The next question that arises: what's going to happen to diversity under this kind of model? Are we going to see more identifiable species or fewer identifiable species? And what we can see from companies and from computer software and from plants where we've applied genetic engineering, so far basically the main thing that's happened is diversity has plummeted. We haven't seen anything like the diversity that you see in established biological organisms in ecosystems that we've engineered and designed, and it's not terribly clear whether or not that's going to be a general feature of future ecosystems where engineering design plays a major role. However, it does seem fairly plausible. You can kind of argue this both ways, and I haven't formed a concrete opinion on what's going to happen to diversity really, but from all the ecosystems that we've engineered so far, diversity has plummeted, and there's several reasons for it. One is that the kind of consumers, often there's people who want the product and they want to have something uniform. They don't want to have their own unique product. Rather, they want to have the same thing that everybody else has got because they know that that's something that works. They don't want to do trials themselves. They want something that's well established. And if you look at what goes on in biology, part of the reasons we've got such diversity is as resistance to pathogens. And in engineered ecosystems, there are other means of making sure pathogens stay at a relatively low level besides providing diversity. Diversity helps, but there's also a big engineered immune system that is capable of keeping pathogens at a relatively low level, despite the fact that the organisms in the ecosystem are all clones of each other. So it's a similar kind of effect to what you see in a human body, for example, where we've got an immune system, and because of that it doesn't matter too much that all our cells are clones of each other, because we've got another department that's on the case of getting rid of pathogens. So yeah, the fact that our cells are all clones of each other, it's a problem, but it's a problem that's kind of paid for, or the advantages are bigger than the disadvantages, so we put up with the increased risk of pathogen infection and instead deal with the problem by a dedicated immune system, rather than having a high diversity of cells in our body which has some problems of its own. Here's my diagram again. That's basically what I think is going to happen in the future to the species concept. You'll still get a tree, still a visible tree even up here, but at the same time everything's all kind of merging together into one big melting pot of genes basically. So, enjoy.